that affects explicit memory, but not implicit memory, and experimental manipulation that affects memory processing in general. So, for example, level of processing affects performance on explicit memory tasks like recall, but doesn't affect performance on implicit memory tasks like perceptual identification. You can turn that around. There's another experimental manipulation known as modality shift. Subjects study words presented visually and then perform some task with the same words presented orally, or vice versa. It doesn't matter how you do it. And there it turns out that a modality shift affects performance on implicit memory. It affects performance on priming, but doesn't have much of an effect on explicit memory. So there you go. What we see here in all of these studies is what's known in the neuropsychology business as a single dissociation, as defined by the great pioneering neuropsychologist Hans Lucas Teuber. A single dissociation occurs when some single independent variable, which we'll call A, okay, affects performance on an explicit memory task, but doesn't affect performance on an implicit memory task, or, for that matter, vice versa. A single experimental variable, like whether you're amnesic or not, or whether you've studied the words in a deep or a shallow manner, that experimental variable affects performance on one class of tests, like explicit memory, but doesn't affect performance on another class of tests, like implicit memory. And the literature is full of these single dissociations. And they all pretty much look like this, okay? You've got this big effect on explicit memory and no effect on implicit memory. Or sometimes you see the reverse, a big effect on implicit memory, but no effect on explicit memory. Teuber identified another kind of dissociation, however, which is of great interest to neuropsychologists and neuroscientists interested in cognition, which you call the double dissociation. In a double dissociation, you have two independent variables, variable A and variable B. So it doesn't matter what they are at the moment. But it turns out that in a double dissociation, variable A might affect explicit memory, but not implicit memory. But this other variable might affect implicit memory, but not explicit memory. It's a crossover, okay? There's statistically a crossover interaction. Now, actually, I don't like this usage, but we're stuck with it. Again, somebody's got to use somebody else's vocabulary sometime. Teuber was there first with this. This really isn't a double dissociation in my view. I like to think of this as a twin dissociation. From my point of view, a real, genuine dissociation would be a genuine crossover where you'd have a single variable that had a positive effect on, say, explicit memory, but also a negative effect on implicit memory. You rarely see these. This is the holy grail of cognitive neuropsychology, is to see this kind of dissociation. They're very, very, very rare. Mostly what you see in neuropsychology are either single dissociations of this sort or a pair of single dissociations, which is known as a double dissociation. Okay. Going to say just a couple more things. Here, there's a crossover dissociation. In the literature, when you read papers in this area, and including papers by Revan Suo, or even the Revan Suo book, you will see this distinction between explicit and implicit memory characterized in a number of different ways. Okay? I'm using the vocabulary that distinguishes between explicit memory, which is conscious memory, and implicit memory, which is unconscious memory. First question is, why don't you just call it unconscious memory? Okay? Well, Schachter and I were colleagues for several years, and I got to ask him this question over drinks on a couple of occasions. He always gave me the same answer. And what he said was, there's just too much Freudian psychoanalytic overlay and surplus meaning to the term unconscious memory, and I just wanted to stay away from it. okay? So we thought that the explicit-implicit distinction would be kind of theory neutral in some sense, because in recall and recognition, memory is explicit in the subject's performance, okay? When you recall something, you say, I remember. When you recognize something, you say, I remember. In priming effects, memory is implicit in the subject's performance. They're not remembering anything, okay? Not necessarily. When you say ASH, complete that with a legal English word, hardly anybody says, oh, I remember ashcan. You know, they just say ashcan, right? They just, as if they've pulled it out of a mental dictionary. Other theorists will refer to this same distinction in terms of direct versus indirect tests of memory. You'll see this distinction a lot, where recall and recognition directly test the subject's memory, and priming, for example, on word stem completion, is an indirect test. It's like a sneaky test, a test that gets the subject to reveal that he really remembers something after all. Well, it does do that, but the really interesting point here is not that priming is an indirect test of memory. What's really interesting about this is that priming picks up memories that the subject is not consciously aware of, okay? So the direct-indirect the distinction is not really quite right. You will see other investigators, like Larry Squire at UCSD, refer to this same distinction in terms of declarative versus procedural memory, whereas declarative memory is like fact-based memory, and procedural memory is memory revealed in performance. That's not quite right either, because procedural memory has a technical meaning in cognitive psychology, and it doesn't cover priming effects. Finally, Squire and others talk about a declarative versus non-declarative distinction, where what they mean by declarative memory is memory you can declare. You can say, I recognize that, or I recall that. But that's not what declarative memory means in cognitive psychology either. So these terminological alternatives don't really capture the essence of the explicit-implicit distinction, which is this. Explicit memories are consciously accessible to the subject. Implicit memories are not consciously accessible to the subject. Nevertheless, they influence the subject's performance on various kinds of tasks. They influence the subject's experience, thought, and action. Thanks. We'll pick this up on Wednesday and take it into the perceptual domain.